Ever since arriving in the UFC, Paddy Pimblett has made a lot of noise. Following an exciting debut, he gained more fame, sponsorships and headlines that catapulted him into being one of the bigger names in the sport. Now he faces Michael Chandler, an all-action former title contender in what is definitely a step up in competition at UFC 314. What makes this matchup even more interesting is the controversy which surrounds both fighters, and we'll be getting into all of that today. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at whether or not Paddy Pimblett can pass this test, which is undoubtedly the biggest of his career so far. I'll also end the video with my own fight prediction. So let's get into it. Before we get into taking a look at the details of each fighter's game, it's important to discuss where each fighter is heading into this fight. Now, Michael Chandler's coming off the back of that loss to Charles Oliveira that followed his hiatus for 2 years waiting on the sidelines for that Conor McGregor fight. Now, we don't need to go into how detrimental this 2-year break was for Chandler's career. Even for the fans, it robbed us of 2 years of exciting fights from Michael Chandler, because whether or not you like Chandler as a person, you can't deny that he is blockbuster entertainment. And that Charles Oliveira fight, it didn't quite live up to the hype of the Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, or even the first Charles Oliveira fight. And even though Chandler did have some moments in that fight, and he gave us some entertainment as always, there definitely seemed to be a perceived decline. I'm not sure whether it was ring rust or just all the miles and the ages catching up with him, but he didn't seem to quite be the fighter that he was 2 years previously. And that's without even mentioning the illegal shots to the back of Charles Oliveira's head, but we're going to be getting into that cheating narrative a bit later on. Anyway, let's take a look at his opponent, Paddy Pimblett. Paddy Pimblett is coming into this fight off the back of a career best performance against Bobby Green, or King Green, whichever one he's going for nowadays. Although Green is far from a title contender, he's definitely a gatekeeper of that top 10, top 15 of the lightweight division, and definitely somebody who's fraud checked prospects in the past. So whilst this wasn't an elite test for Paddy Pimblett, it definitely marked a step up in competition, and one that he passed with flying colours. Paddy Pimblett looked good both on the feet and on the ground, where he's something of a specialist. And even more important than the performance itself, I feel as though his popularity was hanging in the balance before this fight due to his beef with Ariel Helwani, people perceiving him as being a bit arrogant, the fame going to his head. But the best way to silence the haters, or turning haters into fans, is by performing in the octagon. And the way that he was able to dismantle Bobby Green, attack the legs, get him to take that shot, that really ill-advised shot, where Paddy Pimblett was able to wrap up that triangle and armbar, that eventually both, I think, choked out Bobby Green and broke his arm. It was a real special performance, and something that did win over a lot of fans. So that's where both fighters are heading into this fight. Now let's dive into whether or not I think Paddy can pass this test. There's no question, if you look at the level of opposition that both fighters have faced, that Chandler has a much stronger resume in terms of his opponents fought. He's much more seasoned in that lightweight division. He's fought much better competition, including Charles Oliveira, Dan Hooker, Justin Gaethje and Dustin Poirier. And although he came up short against all of these fighters, apart from Dan Hooker, it does show that he is tried and tested in that lightweight division. He has that veteran experience. He was a Bellator champion. He's really been through the ringer of that lightweight division. And evidence for that is the amount of miles he's put on the clock, the amount of wars that he's been in, even though his fight IQ is definitely questionable at times. And we'll be getting into that a bit later on. So even though Chandler has fallen short against the elite of the lightweight division, he does have that experience, which is invaluable. So if you look at Paddy Pimblett's resume, it is incomparable. His best win, as we just spoke about, was against Bobby Green. So rather than trying to argue against the fact that this is definitely a step up in competition, I think it makes sense to discuss why this matchup makes sense. Paddy Pimblett has made no secret of the fact that he's here for a good time, not a long time. His aim was to get into the UFC, maximise his financial rewards and leave with his health intact, which is such a positive, such a healthy mindset to have. But it also means that he needs to be really intelligent when it comes to his matchmaking, which is why this Michael Chandler fight makes perfect sense. And look, we're going to be talking about Michael Chandler's power very shortly, and he's definitely a finisher, but he's also finishable, and that's one of the reasons why this matchup makes sense for Paddy Pimblett. And for a fighter like Pimblett, who does seem to have his career path really meticulously mapped out, a win against Michael Chandler would automatically put him towards the very top of the lightweight division, fighting other contenders, and potentially giving himself a title shot after one more win. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the skill set of both fighters and how they match up there. I do want to start by saying that I do think Paddy's skill set is underrated. It's easy to take a look at the bravado, his antics outside of the cage, like I said, the beef with Ariel Helwani before, and just think this guy's all style, no substance. But really, when you take a look at the Bobby Green fight in particular, this is a fighter who's improving, and that's something that's really important to see. A lot of the time fighters get to the UFC and they either stagnate or go backwards. They've already had a load of fights and they may have taken quite a bit of damage before getting here. Michael Chandler could actually be a prime example of that. But Paddy Pimblett seems to be a fighter who's getting better. Yes, the Jared Gordon decision was a bit of a stinker. It's pretty hard to argue that he did clearly win that fight, even though he was given the decision by the judges. But Pimblett seems to have made the necessary improvements and tweaks since that fight, and these were demonstrated against Bobby Green. Not only was Paddy Pimblett able to have more success on the feet, and look, Bobby Green's an awkward striker. He normally makes hard work for a lot of fighters. Pimblett was able to tune him up. He used his range really nicely with those leg kicks, and that forced Bobby Green into making a mistake, and Pimblett was able to close the show in the way that he does better than almost anyone in that lightweight division, wrap up a submission and get Bobby Green out of there. But like I said, the main takeaway from that performance was the improvement that he demonstrated. And if he's on this trajectory where he's keeping on getting better, Michael Chandler could be in real trouble here. And as I said, this kind of development just isn't something we've seen in Michael Chandler. And look, you can go back years to his wars against Eddie Alvarez to know that this is a fighter with some serious miles on the clock. And even though on paper he should have all the skills, all the discipline to be an elite level fighter, his fight IQ lets him down so often. I've been screaming at the TV before, begging him to use his wrestling. I remember in the first round against Dustin Poirier, when he was able to get Poirier down. If he'd been able to just continue that kind of game plan in the second and third round, I actually could have seen him cruising to a decision victory there. But he just decided to be an entertainer, for better or worse. The fans love him for this reason. He puts on a show, but ultimately it's cost him more wins than it should have done. It may have given the fans more moments than we deserve, but it's definitely caused him to take more losses than his record should necessarily deserve. And if we're saying that Bobby Green did something stupid in terms of shooting on Paddy Pimblett just before he got submitted, isn't this something you can also see Michael Chandler doing? Someone who very rarely shoots for takedowns, but also has a very questionable fight IQ. Could he engage in the wrestling if he's in trouble and be vulnerable to a submission threat from Paddy Pimblett? Snatching defeat from the jaws of victory is definitely a quote that I could apply to Michael Chandler. And I do think that's where the difference lies between these two fighters. Paddy Pimblett in a recent interview said that he wasn't prepared to take Justin Gaethje on late notice because he was already game planning for Michael Chandler. That tells me that he's very meticulous in the way that he approaches these fights. He's trained specifically for the opponent. And I don't necessarily think that this is something that Michael Chandler does. So in terms of the preparation, I think that Paddy Pimblett will be very focused on Michael Chandler and ways in which he can defeat him. Whereas Chandler, as always, will be looking for ways to put on a show for the fans in attendance. And one way in which he does put on shows for the fans in attendance is through his knockout power. He does have dynamite in both fists. So it makes sense now to talk about the power differential between these two fighters. Now, you'll remember Paddy Pimblett, after eating that left hook to the chin in his debut, I think his first fight in the UFC, he got on the mic and said, look, Scousers don't get knocked out. And although Darren Till may disagree with this quote, you need to recognise that Chandler has serious power in his hands. Just take a look at that Dan Hooker knockout, the way in which Chandler landed a really heavy right hand to the body that forced Dan Hooker's hands down, and then he was able to come over the top with that left hook. And if you couple that with the fact that Paddy does carry his chin very high and he does get hit a lot, this is really where Paddy is vulnerable in this fight. I can see Chandler landing some bombs on Paddy Pimblett. And look, I think Paddy does have a good chin, But against someone who hits like a train like Michael Chandler, all he needs to do is soften him up a couple of times and it could get really sketchy for Paddy Pimblett. So I do think this is the biggest danger for Paddy Pimblett. But circling back to what I just said about his skill set, the fact that he does make improvements fight on fight and he trains specifically for his opponents, he must have seen the way in which Dan Hooker got knocked out by Michael Chandler, the way that Charles Oliveira got dropped by Michael Chandler with that left hook as well. So I'm sure that he will make the necessary defensive tweaks. It's just a question of whether or not he lets the moment get to him. And like I said, you get hit in this game. All it takes is for Chandler to land 1 or 2 shots clean and the fight could take a turn very badly for the Scouser. And on the flip side with Paddy Pimblett, yes, he got that knockout early on. Since then, he's been going for more submissions. He went all the rounds with Tony Ferguson. He got Bobby Green out there with the leg kicks and then that submission. So I think the power in his fist is still something that we're yet to have answered. Michael Chandler has shown to have vulnerabilities to the chin at times, so I don't think it takes a truly explosive knockout artist to really hurt Chandler. So even though the power differential is definitely favoured towards Michael Chandler, I really wouldn't be surprised to see Paddy Pimblett dropping Chandler either, purely because of his vulnerabilities. So let's move on from talking about the striking to taking a look at the grappling. From a pure wrestling perspective, this shouldn't even be close. Michael Chandler is a very decorated college wrestler, but of course it's just not something he typically uses in MMA. I just think we have to accept that this is who Michael Chandler is. He'd much rather put on a show for the fans than use his fight IQ, but I do think that this could cost him in this fight. But let's make a very clear point here. Michael Chandler doesn't normally get submitted. I think the Dustin Poirier, the rear naked choke there, I think that's the only time that Michael Chandler has been submitted. He's gone the distance with Charles Oliveira. He's been in sketchy positions previously. Charles Oliveira had his back locked up in that first round of the first fight when both fighters were fairly dry and he was unable to get Chandler out of there. Chandler does have very good submission defense, and if Charles Oliveira can't get you out of there, the guy who has the record amount of submissions in the lightweight division, do you think that Paddy Pimblett can do it? I'm not too sure, but I do think this is a key area in which this fight could be determined. I can't really see Paddy Pimblett taking Michael Chandler down, at least not in a typical double leg wrestling situation. I know Paddy does like his judo trips, so perhaps if there's a bit of clinching against the fence, Paddy might be able to trip Chandler and get him down that way. But I think that Paddy Pimblett will be relying on the failure of Michael Chandler's fight IQ, whether that's going in for an ill-advised shot or it just getting really messy on the feet and both guys taking a tumble to the canvas. Another interesting point about this fight is that Michael Chandler's legs do get compromised. We know how badly affected Bobby Green's legs were in the fight against Paddy Pimblett, which is why that led to the shot. If Paddy Pimblett can use his range as well in this fight and really get at Chandler's legs, I don't know if you've seen that fight in Bellator, I think it was, where Chandler's calf seemed to give way, his ankle kept rolling over. That might have just been a freak accident, it probably was, but it also shows that Chandler can be affected by leg kicks. So if Paddy Pimblett can really damage him there, the grappling exchanges might work out much better in his favour. Anyway, moving on, and before we get into the fight prediction itself, I do want to talk about the controversy that surrounds both of these fighters, because it does add fuel to the fire. It's one of the reasons why this fight is so anticipated, the fact that there does have to be a loser, and both of these fighters have courted their own controversy. Firstly, with Paddy Pimblett. He was one half of that feud with Ariel Helwani which took place last year that really caused the fan base to turn against Paddy Pimblett. Allegedly, Paddy refused to do an interview on Ariel's show without being paid, something that Ariel Helwani said was unprecedented, which led fans to believe that Paddy was getting way too big for his boots and needed knocking down a peg or two. The fact that Paddy Pimblett then doubled down on his hatred towards Ariel Helwani in a podcast with Dana White, where he kind of came across as a bit of a company man, just supporting Dana White in all his outlandish statements, meant that rather him being the babyface Paddy Pimblett, he was actually one of the more divisive fighters in the UFC. Then if we're going to take a look at his opponent, Michael Chandler, he's someone from the outside who seems like the perfect guy, always preaching discipline, motivation, but fighters think he's a cheat, fighters think he's dirty, and the fans have cottoned onto this. The fact that all the fighters seem to hate Michael Chandler. There's been a lot of digging into this, and when you look at Michael Chandler's cheating highlights, there's a lot of material there, whether it's shots to the back of the head against Oliveira, the alleged fish hook, well, I'm not sure it was alleged, the fish hook against Dustin Poirier. There have been multiple instances where Michael Chandler has gone from being this, again, this like babyface entertainer to this real cheating, win at all costs kind of guy. And it's caused both of these characters to not only elevate their statuses in the sport for the wrong reason, but also led fans to wait for their demise, wait for their downfall, which is why this fight is so exciting. Without sitting on the fence, I do think that both of these factors have been blown out of proportion. With Paddy Pimblett and his beef against Ariel Helwani, I just think he's a bit of a hot-headed fighter. He shoots from the hip, he probably says some stuff that he doesn't really mean. And against an articulate debater like Ariel Helwani, someone who you just wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of, someone who keeps all the receipts, you're never going to look good. And as far as Michael Chandler goes, I do just think he's a bit of a dirty fighter. I love watching him fight. I think the stuff that he says, the motivational stuff, it might be quite cringy to some people. I quite like it. But I do think that he's just a bit of a dirty fighter. I do think that if he realises the fight isn't going his way, he will do whatever it takes to stop himself getting finished or trying to get the finish on his opponent. Let me know if you do agree with my take on that, and whilst you're at it, please subscribe to the channel, like this video and comment below. Anyway, let's move on to the fight prediction itself. Now, this is clearly a very tough fight to call, as it's a massive step up in competition for Paddy Pimblett, but Michael Chandler does seem like a fighter on the decline. I think that all the miles on the clock, the wars that he's been in, they all take their toll, as well as the 2 years off waiting for Conor McGregor. His skill set doesn't seem to have developed. In fact, his striking just seemed less dynamic against Charles Oliveira. And if you compare him to Paddy Pimblett, a fighter who seems to be improving all the time, and especially that performance against Bobby Green, where he did seem to level up his striking, fighting really well at range and getting a finish, I am leaning towards Paddy Pimblett in this fight. I think my main concern is the power differential in this fight. Chandler can land absolute bombs, but if Paddy Pimblett has made the adjustments, I know he's been training specifically for Michael Chandler. If he makes the adjustments and he's able to get his head off the centre line, avoid eating that big left hook, the big overhand right that Michael Chandler loves to land, then I can see him compromising Chandler's legs and possibly even getting a submission. But overall, if I had to give my firmest prediction on this one, I'd lean towards a 48-47 decision for Paddy Pimblett. So based on that outcome, what would be next for both fighters? As far as Michael Chandler goes, it would be yet another loss on his record. And for me, that would firmly relegate him from status of potential title contender to being a gatekeeper of the lightweight division. I think there's so many fun matchups that you can put him in. He's a great way to open up a main card of a pay-per-view. But in terms of potential title shots or even number one contender fights, I think he'd be a far cry from that. And let's face it, he probably will call out Conor McGregor regardless. So would him losing this fight make that fight even more likely to happen? I think possibly, because weight class wouldn't even really be a consideration for it. For Paddy Pimblett, he's already made his intentions clear. If he beats the number 7 ranked Michael Chandler, he wants a top 5 guy. Be it a Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, Arman Tsarukyan, and then Islam Makhachev would be next. Like I said before, Pimblett's career path is very clearly marked out, so if he gets past Michael Chandler, he knows what's next. But of course, there is one fight that fans would love to see, and it is against hand sanitizer boy, Ilia Topuria, the new guy in the lightweight division, someone who already has history with Paddy Pimblett. That fight could very well be next. It would definitely be massively hyped up. I'd love to see it in Europe, whether it's at the Madrid Stadium or in the UK. It would be an awesome fight. But personally, I do think this is the biggest test of Paddy Pimblett's career to date. I think it's one that he probably does pass. Michael Chandler probably will call out Conor McGregor again, even if he loses, even if it comes out on X a few days later. I just think that's a fight that he really wants to get over the line. The UFC must have promised it over and over again to him, but based on Conor McGregor's recent remarks, the fact that he's more focused now on politics rather than fighting, it makes that fight even more unlikely. Could Michael Chandler's 2 years off be the biggest regret of his career?